Band of Brothers is arguably the greatest TV series ever made. I know it's a bold statement, but I think it is. And regardless, it's definitely the greatest limited series ever made, as it sat at number 2 in the IMDb top shows behind the masterpiece which is Breaking Bad. But I think that Band of Brothers almost sits in its own category and can't really be compared to the 5-season fictional story by Vince Gilligan. I've been covering Band of Brothers and doing weekly breakdowns, but after revisiting it and now being past the halfway point, I really wanted to delve into why this show is so good and what makes it perfect. I'll be jumping into the different reasons and hopefully highlighting things that you already agree with, but if you don't, then maybe I'll be able to shine a new light on the show for you. So let's not wait any longer. Here is why Band of Brothers is perfect even 20 years later. Just to let you know, this video will contain spoilers. The interviews. One thing that for me makes this show so good is the interviews that are present at the start of every episode. At the time of going through the show, we didn't know the identity of the people that were being interviewed, but we knew that some of them were most likely the individuals that were in the show being portrayed by the actors. What these interviews served as was a reminder that what we were watching was real. It happened to real people and they experienced all of the horrors that we went on to see. They were the real-life heroes that fought for the freedom of the world, and hearing them share their first-hand stories, even for a minute and a half at the start, was enough to make you feel a sense of gratitude. They would often say things about the death that was present, the ice-cold temperatures in Bastogne, how things that happened during the war impacted them on other occasions throughout their lives, and more often than not, when something would happen in the episodes, whether it be subtle or a major thing, you'd think back to something that they'd previously said at the start, and it would hit home that this is probably what they were experiencing at the time. Not knowing the identity of the individuals was something that did sit in your mind throughout the entirety of the show, because as the episodes went on, you didn't know who it was that was going to survive the ordeal that they were going through. But when it was revealed at the end, it was a moment that was just beautiful to watch. I remember during the final moments, as their names were placed alongside them right at the end, with the story concluding and the incredible score playing in the background, it was such an emotional moment, arguably the most emotional moment in the show. The fact that the veterans were alive at the time was something that made this show stand out when compared to the likes of Masters of the Air. Obviously, there are far less veterans alive in 2024 when compared to 2001, but having that sense of grounding and understanding that these were real people that were being depicted just added to the nature of it being a haunting reality, and a part of their life that made up a huge part of who they were. The Brotherhood. The brotherhood and camaraderie of the characters in the show was something that I feel just hasn't been replicated in anything else that has come since. Even when The Pacific was made, it didn't feel like there was that sense of camaraderie on a larger scale like there was in the show. When Band of Brothers was being made, the cast members were placed into a boot camp for several days where they were under strict rules and being treated as if they were going off to war in the 40s. They were referred to by their character names, lost their real names upon entry, would go out on patrols in landscapes, and they were staying at the training camp and going through the routine of what somebody dropping in on D-Day would have done. This is something that you can definitely see helped when it came to not only making their actions, movements, and approaches as realistic as possible, but it also benefited the friendships and camaraderie that they all had together. They became friends in real life, they became brothers in real life, and that was something that carried through into the show, whether that be deliberate or not. They genuinely felt like a band of brothers. From watching them going through training at Camp Toccoa, to then seeing every man that was lost at Breakor, Eindhoven, Bastogne and beyond, the togetherness was paramount in a show like this. A show about people needing to care for one another in order to survive, and it was just so perfectly executed. It showed that the toughest people can be the most caring and brave, and many were genuinely willing to put their own lives on the line if it meant that they were able to help their brother that needed them at that moment. Each character genuinely had their own personality and trait that you latched onto, and it became their thing. When the actors were given their roles, they were given a large folder with information on the real-life person that they were depicting, and they were tasked with researching the person and reaching out and speaking to them if the veteran was comfortable in doing so. This enabled the actors to truly get into character and to pick up the mannerisms, behaviours, and also the friendships that they'd have whilst they were in Europe during the 40s. Something that again allowed the characters to feel like real human beings and for them to be depicted in the most authentic and respectful way possible. The depiction of war. One way in which I think this show stands out when compared to many others is the depiction of war and the realness that it conveys. It doesn't hold back when it comes to showing us graphic things, the horrific mindset that could often be present, and the sheer amount of death and devastation that was there too. It bore a similar resemblance to Saving Private Ryan in the way that it looked, and that's kind of obvious because of Spielberg and Hanks, but at the same time, it did stand out even when compared to that. Seeing how life could be taken in the blink of an eye, whether that be going up in the air and expecting to land in Normandy but being fired out of the sky and not even being able to fight in the war that you trained so hard for, or even just as simple as a pistol going off in your pocket, it showed how valuable life was, but how easy it could be taken in a multitude of different ways. I also thought that things such as the environment were made into actual tangible things in the show. Take Bastogne for example. They were holding their line in the Ardennes forest, and the Germans, the enemy, were on the other side. However, there was another enemy during this time period, and it was the environment and the harsh, unforgiving conditions. Blankets of snow on the floor, fog which meant that they couldn't get supplies to the troops, and temperatures where they were literally freezing. The fact that it was the coldest recorded temperature in that location up until that point was something which came across the screen. You genuinely felt cold when watching this episode, and it made the odds of surviving feel even less because you were against two different enemies. One character that I think perfectly looked like he'd been through a war by the end of it was Malarkey. When we were first introduced to him, he was a smiley, happy-go-lucky, funny guy, but by the end, around episode 8, we saw that he'd lost many of his friends that he was closest to. He looked disheveled and he participated in more battles than anybody else in Easy, and you could see that on him. He was a shell of the person when compared to who he was at the start, so seeing that clear change in character in him perfectly highlighted the effects of war. One other element of the way that war was shown to us in Band of Brothers that I thought was incredible was the camera angles that would often be used. In some small trenches that would often be dug, you'd be right amongst it. There'd be handheld camera movements and you'd feel the swarm of bullets that were coming what would be your way because it would feel like you were there. As well as that, in Bastogne, the sheer firepower when the forest was being blown to pieces was just nightmare-inducing. The close-ups that would often be present on people's faces when they were suffering was something that also contributed to the emotional weight that we'd feel as a viewer when watching this. Take Blythe for example. When the explosions were going off around him and he was just in the foxhole hiding and screaming and wanting to be anywhere else but there, having the camera right up close to his face enabled us to truly understand what was going on in his mind. The way that this story was told when compared to the Pacific is something that I think is one of the main reasons as to why the Pacific doesn't work as well, because the story wasn't that easy to digest. Band of Brothers follows a linear passage of time from 2 years prior to the drop in Normandy with training in Camp Toccoa right through until the end of the war. Within that wide overarching story, we have smaller dedicated moments from episodes which are focused on battles such as Brecourt, Market Garden, Bastogne, Carentan, Foy, Normandy, and more. But each of these individual battles is seen from a different character's perspective, whether that be Bull, Blythe, Eugene Rowe, Nixon, Winters, or Lipton. It enabled the story to become extremely digestible, and for each and every one of these characters to get their moment to shine, and for the real heroes to get the recognition that they deserved. This approach in storytelling enabled us to understand the characters in a deeper way, and it meant that we could form stronger connections to the characters that might have just been off to the side if we didn't get a full episode with them. Rather than seeing the war from the perspective of one pair of eyes, we saw it with multiple, and with that came different figures of the war, and it showed that people experience it in completely different ways. Some are like Spears, and others are like Blythe, and neither is right or wrong, it's just the way that it impacts people. Band of Brothers was so digestible, and it evoked emotions from me that I didn't expect to feel when I first put the show on. I connected with these characters in a way that I could never have imagined, and it gave me a newfound respect for every single person that went through what was depicted on screen and fought during the Second World War. The things that these people went through are simply unimaginable, and they really are heroes. The sound. The score in this show is just simply incredible. The theme music in itself is just iconic, and Michael Kamen created a piece of music that just so perfectly felt inspirational yet melancholic and haunting at the same time. All the feelings that we experience when watching the show. I'm growing to enjoy listening to the scores in TV shows and movies a lot more in recent times, because for a long while I didn't actually pay that much attention to it. But in actual fact, most of the time, the sound can often be the very thing that pushes you over the edge when it comes to actually expressing the emotions that the show wants you to feel in that moment. And it was no different in Band of Brothers. When it came to the sound in other elements of the show, that was something that was just amazing as well. The sound of war was encapsulated in the show, and it provided what I imagine is only a glimpse into the nightmare-inducing sound of war. Guns, screams, explosions, and even a language that you don't truly understand in a hostile environment. They're all things that I think really did add to the experience when watching the show. My conclusion. As you can see, I'm a huge fan of the show. I firmly believe it's one of the best TV series ever made, and the best war piece I've ever seen. The fact that it was made over 20 years ago and there's been nothing to really compete with it speaks volumes to how ahead of its time the show was. At the time, in 2001, even when the show went into production in 1999, there weren't multi-million-dollar budgets that were being thrown at the silver screen. Hollywood and cinema was where the money was being placed, and I feel as though this sort of show laid down the foundations and paved the way for the high-budget all-star cast that we get on TV today. Granted, it still took time, probably the rise of streaming and the turn of the 2010s for it to really come into effect, but they took a risk and it definitely paved the way. I honestly don't think there will be a better depiction of war or the telling of the events in a piece of educational entertainment that's quite as good as Band of Brothers. The closest thing in recent times is the Netflix movie All Quiet on the Western Front. They tried to replicate Band of Brothers' success with the likes of The Pacific and also more recently Masters of the Air, but even that didn't quite feel the same. They were incredible to watch, don't get me wrong, but they just didn't land like Band of Brothers. The story is just so well told, so delicately handled, and the fact that the veterans and people that were depicted in the show were alive at the time and were able to get their story across, it just made it all the more real and powerful to watch, because they were the true heroes in all of this. So, there you have it, why Band of Brothers is perfect even 20 years later. If you want to see my episode breakdowns on Band of Brothers, then click on the card in the top corner. You'll find an entire playlist on them, or alternatively, you can head over to my channel where you'll find them all. What's your favourite episode of Band of Brothers? I think mine has to be episode 6, Bastogne, or maybe episode 7, The Breaking Point, which is focused on Lipton. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. As always, thanks for tuning into the video, and I'll see you in the next one.